Delay of Reindeer Games. By Melinda Curtis. Chapter 1. Somewhere, someone blared "Deck the Halls" through their car speakers. It had to be car speakers because "fa la 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 la" seemed to come from Helen Wheeler's right and then moved to somewhere behind her. A man's voice boomed over the song. "Welcome to Christmas Town." "Fa la 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 humbug," Helen grumbled. She finished filling the wheelbarrow with pine boughs she'd cut from her friend Becca's backyard just as a light snow began to fall again. The music ended. Helen hoped her lack of holiday cheer would also end come Sunday, the day after the Christmas Town High School reunion held its last event. Everyone dreads their high school reunion, Helen continued to grumble as she tromped through a few inches of snow, pushing the wheelbarrow to the side gate. Deck the Halls stopped playing mid-fa la la. A car door slammed. The overly enthusiastic Christmas lover apparently lived nearby. Helen unlatched the side gate and pushed it open, and then shoved the wheelbarrow through to the front yard. "Hell on wheels," a deep male voice teased from the front walk. Helen gritted her teeth and dropped her wheelbarrow to the ground, hating that what she dreaded about the reunion was hitting her this early in the weekend. Hell on Wheels was the nickname Brandy Sue Duckweiler had given Helen as a freshman during a 1970s-themed rally week where Helen had been chosen to compete in a roller skating race. Given that Helen was capriciously tall, nearly 6 feet, and not athletically inclined, she'd sat the bench on the volleyball and basketball teams. Why would anyone think she could stay on her feet on roller skates? Stupid high school reunion. Who remembered her that way? Only everyone. Helen pasted a smile on her face and turned. A strong pair of arms encircled her, dragging her forward to be crushed against a broad chest. And then she was released and held at arm's length by. Helen froze. Hell on Wheels. Marshall Jacobs sked. "Becca didn't tell me you were in town." Likewise, Helen mumbled, grinning and blushing furiously as Becca's older brother, Helen's high school crush, continued to hold her in place. "Aren't you on injured reserve?" He played for the Boston Bruins and had received a concussion a week ago. "Should you be driving? Or should he be at home in a dark room under a nurse's care?" "It's just a bump on the head." Marsh gave Helen that trademark grin that used to cause her legs to shake like a bowlful of jelly. He wore a black leather bomber's jacket, a Bruins baseball cap and mirrored aviator sunglasses. "I'm in the NHL's concussion protocol. Nothing to worry about. Unless you don't normally blare holiday tunes out your open truck window in the middle of a snowstorm." Helen knew she should step back and compose herself. She was grinning back at Marsh, still blushing, and couldn't bring herself to move a muscle, not in her face or in her legs, because he was looking at her with a flirty gleam in his eye. "He sees me." Helen smiled harder. "I am going to regret this later." All of it. The grinning. The blushing. The feeling that Marsh actually saw her as a member of the opposite sex, not one of his little sister's friends. Marsh's grin broadened. "You heard me sing. If you prefer, I could belt out some Beatles tunes and..." Helen Wheels is by Sir Paul McCartney, not the Beatles. And the song was about his Range Rover, not Helen Wheeler, formerly of Christmas Town. Helen stopped grinning and stepped clear of those strong hands on her shoulders. Marsh bent his head to look at her over the rim of his sunglasses. "You don't like your nickname?" "No, why sugarcoat it?" She gave it all to him. Not Hell on Wheels. Not Gigantier. Not Crash. And in case you were wondering, no, I don't play basketball or volleyball any better than I did in high school, because I'm no more coordinated now than I was at 14 when I ran into you while roller skating. Helen pressed her lips closed and clasped her hands, feeling the ring she and Becca had found in the time capsule press into her finger beneath her glove. Why did I have to bring that crash up? Because the things she desperately wanted to keep inside had a way of blurting past her lips. And why did I put on that ring? Because she knew she'd needed a reminder to drop it off at the high school's lost and found. Got it. Height and sports jokes are off limits. Marsh held up his hands in surrender. Apologies. Can I buy you a cup of coffee at the teapot if I promise not to mention any of my fond memories of you from our childhood? Absolutely not. Helen stumbled back, nearly slipping in the snow. Do you know how many people from my graduating class are in town this weekend? Not to mention everyone who's returning to town the last weekend before Christmas. There will be no place to hide from nicknames or so-called fond remembrances. His dark brows quirked. Class reunions are supposed to be joyous times. Helen huffed. Only if high school was a joyous time. But, Marsh frowned. You were happy. I have fond memories of you and Becca giggling while wrapping Christmas presents under the tree. A gust of wind blew snow flurries in Helen's face. She wiped them away, staring across Gingerbread Loop at a peaceful nativity scene. She supposed it wouldn't matter how old she was, when she was back in Christmas Town, she was still that awkward girl who stood out. Can we not talk about this? Marsh took her arm. No. I want to know. If anyone brings up your past in a way you don't like, You'll what? Helen smirked, because the alternative was melting beneath his touch. You'll threaten to beat up whoever teases me or makes me feel awkward about my lack of coordination. I'm used to it now, Marsh. It's just that, back then, I didn't know how to deal with it. And now that you have to face them all again, it's awkward. He hugged Helen once more. She held herself as straight as a hockey stick lest she soften against him and turn her face up for a kiss. She still might. That had always been her dream, after all. In the yard across the street, the lights outlining the nativity scene flickered on. It would be dark soon and she still had the ring from the time capsule to turn in before the school office closed. Helen stepped out of his embrace. What's with the hugging? Marsh wasn't a hugger. He released her, cheeks ruddy, although that might have been from the wind. Can't a guy hug a friend at Christmas? You're not the hugging type, especially with your little sister's friends. Who'd all had crushes on him growing up. They'd all wished he'd turn all that charm their way, but to no avail. You've become Marsh the Masher. Last week, I saw you body check a dude against the glass during a game. After said opponent had done the same to him moments earlier. Helen considered Marsh carefully. Why are you here? You haven't been released from the NHL's concussion protocol. You're as bad as the press. The wind ruffled Marsh's dark hair. He rolled his broad shoulders back. Behind him, the flat, inflatable snowman in Becca's yard began to fill with air. Don't create ripples in the smooth waters of my life, Helen. And don't worry about this weekend. I'm going to watch out for you, the same way I always watched out for you girls. All around Gingerbread Loop, Christmas decorations were coming to life. And now, Marsh was bringing Helen's childhood dreams to life as well. This was surreal. You're going to watch out for me. She forced sarcasm into her words. By doing what? His gaze hardened. By protecting you from bad memories. Don't get carried away. Marsh Jacobs, professional hockey star, had much more important things to do with his time than protect Helen from her insecurities. Snow fell between them, as light and gentle as if they were suddenly brought to life in a holiday card. I'm serious. His dark eyes lit upon Helen. What are you up to with all these fir boughs? You're not serious. You're being difficult. Helen tried to change the subject. I don't have time for you. And she didn't want to make a complete fool of herself by accepting his offer either. I have to stop by the high school and then get to the community center Helen checked her phone. Shoot. 20 minutes. With a wheelbarrow? Helen nodded. I'm creating wreaths for the reunion dinner tonight. She returned to the wheelbarrow and picked up the handles. Gotta go. I've already missed the school window. So much for turning in the ring. And I'm the one with the emergency contact info for dinner attendees. The front wheel crunched through the snow. He fell into step alongside her. I'll tag along. Why? Because I haven't seen you in forever and he made a manly sound of frustration. I was serious about making sure no one hurts you this weekend. Helen didn't say anything. But one phrase kept repeating in her head, and it wasn't fa la 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 la. It was, that man hit his head harder than I thought. Chapter 2. Becca and Delta roped you into helping with the reunion. It wasn't a question. Marsh walked next to Helen. It was late Friday afternoon and traffic on this end of town was light. Up ahead, the snowy town square was bustling with people, including the Victorian choir, singing the wassail song. You wouldn't have come if they hadn't asked you. Yes, Helen said quickly. Flatly. All anyone remembers of you are your sports successes. All anyone remembers of me are my sports failures. That's not true. Anyone who looks at you today won't remember the past. Marsh looked. He looked his fill. And he liked what he saw. As a girl, Helen had always been gangly and nearly as tall as he was. Back in elementary school, she'd been all knees and elbows, the kind of kid who'd grown too fast and their sense of balance hadn't caught up. Ever. In high school, he'd always thought of her as a delicate thing. She'd been a pale blonde. Quiet. And then Becca had dragged him to a performance of It's a Wonderful Life with Helen starring as Mary. He'd been captivated by Helen's charm and confidence on the stage. After that, he'd been unable to think of her as anything other than remarkable. Days later, when Becca found Marsh hanging around the school theater trying to catch Helen's attention in between hockey practices, his sister had accused him of wanting to date her friend. True, so he pretended to be interested in Brandy Sue Duckweiler. Not true. Back then, he and Becca had a pact, no dating each other's friends. To throw Becca off track, he'd asked Brandy Sue out. It had been tortuous. She'd planned the next 10 years of their life together. On their first date, Marsh stopped to straighten a set of tilted candy cane lights lining the sidewalk. Helen paused, waiting for him. She was still willowy and graceful. She wore a black knit cap over her pale blonde hair, which swung across her back with each step of those long, long legs. But it was her heart-shaped face and those big green eyes that made him want to sit in silence and look at her, because something about Helen had always brought him a measure of peace. And now, when he needed peace in his life, it was the ideal time to test the waters with her. Everything all right back there? Helen had set the wheelbarrow down and was staring at him. You're staring at me with a faraway look in your eye. You'd let me know if you were seeing flashes of light, wouldn't you? He forced out a laugh. Other than the twinkle lights framing every window. I'm serious. You didn't pass concussion protocol. My reactions on the ice in practice weren't crisp enough for the doctors, but I'm fine. Really? Marsh laughed off her concern, but he wasn't laughing inside. This was his 5th concussion in more than 10 years in the NHL. Each time, the recovery took a little longer. And his doctor, his personal physician, not the team doctor, had told him he shouldn't risk another. To be fair to the team doctor, Marsh hadn't asked him about long-term risks. But he hadn't passed stage 6 of the league's concussion protocol this morning. And so, he'd come home, driving with the window down and singing at the top of his lungs to make sure he was alert on the road. Enough about me. What have you been doing with yourself? I work for a nursery outside of Boston as a landscape architect. Marsh smiled. Do you remember that summer we worked at Christmas Greenery? The nursery in town. He'd gotten kicked off his summer youth hockey team for fighting and his parents had told him to get a job. Helen chuffed, creating a cloud of air that quickly dissipated. You worked there all summer and by September you still didn't know an annual from a perennial. I was mostly there to help customers load the heavy stuff into their vehicles. Helen, he recalled, had started at the register but soon moved to helping customers who had questions about plants and plant care. They stopped at the corner of the town square. It was coming up on 5 p.m. Traffic on the sidewalk and on the road was increasing. "When are you going to retire, Marsh?" Helen's cheeks flushed with color. "I didn't mean to be blunt. It's just," she cast a glance his way. "You're an old man by hockey standards." 30 isn't old, Marsh said gruffly. "What would I do if I retired?" "I don't know. Enjoy life. Settle down. Be a house husband and stay-at-home dad," Helen teased, blushing as she charged into the sidewalk. "You wouldn't abuse your body. Haven't you read anything about CTE or the short lifespan of athletes who suffer repeated concussions?" "I don't have blinders on. Forget being nostalgic for the past. Or pleased with Helen's company." Now he was mad. Anger lengthened his stride. House husband. Stay-at-home dad. What about commentator? Or coach? "Sorry, not sorry." Helen scoffed. "I'm sure you've made enough money that you never have to work again, not that I'm prying into your business. If you don't count advising me to retire and live out the rest of my short life as a kept man." Marsh dodged a woman loaded down with bulky bags filled with wrapped gifts. The sun set. They passed the gazebo in the town square as the lights blazed on. The gazebo was rumored to predict a wedding in the coming year if a couple exchanged a kiss beneath its arched roof. A few people called out his name. Marsh waved and kept walking, spotting the community center's roofline in the distance, almost of a mind to make his excuses and leave Helen to it. He was worried for nothing. She could take care of herself. "You don't want to stop and talk to anyone?" Helen slanted him a glance. "No." "Helen." A woman wearing a bright red apron hailed Helen from the doorway to Glad Tiding Florist at the next corner. "I'm glad I caught you. Someone canceled an order and I have an extra bouquet. I bet you can use it at the class reunion dinner tonight." "Thanks. Becca and Delta will appreciate it." Helen set the wheelbarrow down as the woman darted back inside and gave Marsh a searching look. She led him to the florist's brick porch pillar. "You look like you need to catch your breath, old man." He did, but only because, unexpectedly, with a touch, she'd stolen his. It was all Marsh could do not to reach out and hold on to her, and maybe steal a kiss. Before he could act on that impulse, a redhead with a pink beret separated herself from the crowd and beelined for Marsh. Talk about bad memories. Instinctively, he grabbed onto Helen and slung his arm across her shoulders, whispering, "Incoming." The redhead drew up short. "Oh. Helen dash. It's just Helen, Brandy Sue," Helen ground out, subtly elbowing Marsh in the ribs. She gave him an arched look, as if to say, "What are you up to?" He was up to protecting Helen from the woman who'd picked on others in Becca and Helen's class and had wanted to marry Marsh after just one date. Marsh drew Helen closer. "Nice to see you, Brandy Sue. Are you in town for the reunion?" Brandy Sue nodded. "My husband and I," she craned her neck, rising up on her toes. "Where did he get to?" "He just joined a sports marketing firm." "I know he'd want to meet you, Marsh. I've told him all about you. And you, too, Helen. You were always the best understudy." Marsh pressed a kiss to Helen's cheek. "Except that time Helen starred in It's a Wonderful Life and you were Helen's understudy." Helen elbowed him again, harder this time. "Hey," he whispered, squeezing her closer in retaliation, trying to remove the option of elbow strikes. "I'm sure we'll be seeing more of you around town this weekend, Brandy Sue." "Not if I can help it." "We?" Brandy Sue gave them a searching look. "You're together?" "Yep." Marsh glanced up at the mistletoe hanging above them. Did he dare kiss Helen? Helen was staring at the sprig, too. She swallowed and turned her face toward Marsh, who was suddenly incredibly appreciative of holiday traditions. When I was growing up, mistletoe used to scare me. Helen arched a slender brow. That's what scares Marsh Jacobs. No, he shook his head slowly, bringing his lips closer to hers. Here's your bouquet. The florist handed Marsh a mix of roses and mistletoe, ruining the chance for that kiss. You make such a cute couple. I see tall, athletic babies in your future. Helen made a choking sound, cheeks blazing with color as red as the mistletoe berries above them. Marsh made a show of gifting Helen with the bouquet. She rolled her eyes at him. We'd love to stay and chat, Brandy Sue. Helen put the flowers on top of the pine boughs and moved into her place behind the wheelbarrow. But I've got to get these wreaths made and up before the reunion dinner. See you later. Marsh drew Helen back, handed the bouquet back to her, and then he took charge of the wheelbarrow. Lots to do, Brandy Sue. Merry Christmas. Will we see you at dinner, Marsh? Brandy Sue darted in front of him, but her sly gaze was centered on Helen. It's not his reunion. Helen looked like she might bop Marsh over the head with the bouquet. But I am Helen's date for the weekend. Marsh bared his teeth, both his God-given pearls and the implants he'd gotten over the years. Gotta run, honey bear. Helen narrowed her eyes at him. He'd been on the receiving end of nicer looks from opponents on the ice. Chapter 3. You're not my date. No one will believe that. Helen was still flummoxed several minutes later when she and Marsh sat at a table fastening pine boughs to round wire forms. The community center had been decorated with Christmas trees and twinkle lights. The round dinner tables were waiting for the wreath centerpieces to surround the candles. Helen had set the donated bouquet on the lobby table with the as yet unclaimed reunion name tags and ditched the wheelbarrow out in the back with the catering truck from 12 Nights. Becca had texted that there had been a few cancellations for dinner, so there was no reason to turn Marsh away, other than the obvious: Helen didn't want to be the talk of the reunion. The ring on her finger twinkled, reminding Helen it wasn't her ring and belonged at the high school lost and found. What would Brandy Sue think if she saw it? That she and Marsh were engaged. Oh, boy. Helen sighed and fixed Marsh with a stern look. Brandy Sue is more efficient than social media in spreading disinformation. Brandy Sue believed I was your date, Marsh pointed out. I think it's you who needs to be more open-minded. He grinned. About dating me. Are you doing this because of what I said earlier? About awkward reunions? I don't need your protection. Helen carefully bent boughs to the wire form. Suddenly, she stopped. This has nothing to do with me. It's you. Moi. Yes, you need protection from. Helen paused to think this through. You've never been comfortable with hero worship. Are you afraid your Christmas Town fans will fawn over you because of your wonky brain? My wonky, Marsh glanced around, lowering his voice. I am perfectly capable of handling the attention that comes with success, but, he frowned. But what? Helen capitalized on that slip. This goes no farther. He shook his finger at her. I talked to Bruins management about retiring this morning when I didn't pass concussion protocol. It was a total knee-jerk reaction. I know they're going to leak it any time now because my contract is up for renewal at the end of the season. He changed from finger shaking to finger pointing. None of which has anything to do with you. Face it, I'm just here to offer my support to a nervous old friend. Helen scoffed. He fixed her with a hot stare. I like you, Helen. I always have. It's no crime to want to spend time with you and see if we click. And if it makes your life easier, so be it. He wanted to spend time with her. Helen rolled her eyes. As usual, you are so full of it, Marsh. Christmas cheer, you mean. He grinned, unrepentant, so handsome it made her heart pound. Why didn't you tell me you were living in Boston? We could have had dinner or hung out. She shook her head. Tell me about the rest of the schedule this weekend. Marsh changed tactics. What are we doing? Helen could either continue to argue or let him pretend this pretend dating thing was going to happen. Given her classmates were beginning to arrive, Helen chose the latter. There's a dinner tonight, followed by a bonfire. Lots of activities tomorrow. And then a cocktail party and dance on Saturday. He leaned forward. I can make this easier on you. In fact, bold prediction, let me be your date this weekend, and instead of praying the reunion ends quickly, you'll be wishing it would never end. He captured her right hand, stroking his thumb over the lengths of her fingers. All Helen wanted to do was close the distance between them and press her lips to his. All she wanted. Oh. My. Word. Helen's jaw dropped. You're marshing me. He sat back, but still held on to her hand. What in the world does that mean? I can't count the number of times I saw you sweet-talk your mom out of punishing you for something. And you could always charm a girl into a smile or a laugh. Or a date. Helen tried to tug her hand free. I see you, Marsh Jacobs. And I see right through you. You're meant to see me. His voice held just a trace of impatience. I want you to see me. This isn't a song and dance, Helen. He shoved out of his chair and came around the table to sit next to her, taking up room, crowding her. People glanced their way. Pointed. Whispered things. Despite the attention, Helen refused to back down. I'm not some princess in need of protection so you feel like a hero. And I'm not some playboy testing his powers of persuasion on any woman in the vicinity. Let me confess something. Marsh leaned in close, speaking so low that no one could hear but Helen. I've had a crush on you for years. If you hadn't been one of Becca's close friends, I would have asked you out in high school. Helen crossed her arms and pinched herself, blushing furiously. Marsh drew back. Aren't you going to say something? She shook her head slowly back and forth, not knowing what to believe. At the florist shop, she thought he'd wanted to kiss her, but then she'd told herself it was a trick of the twinkle lights and a return of her childish fantasies. And now? If you're speechless, Marsh chuckled. Then it's long past time that I did this. He kissed her. It was marvelous. Warm and giving, like a longed-for gift surprisingly bestowed upon her at the holiday season. She drew back, gasping in astonishment as his thumb tenderly traced her cheek. Marsh. We're not even standing under the mistletoe. I can't believe you wormed your way into my high school reunion, Becca told her brother Marsh as they were sitting down to dinner in the community center. The edge was missing from her words though, and she was grinning like a love-struck idiot at her date, Dr. Owen Price, Becca's longtime best friend. The pair had finally admitted what everyone else had known for years: they were made for each other. I can't believe it either, Helen groused from the other side of Marsh, refusing to look at him. They hadn't had a chance to talk since that kiss. When it had ended, Marsh had brushed a thumb over Helen's cheek, but she'd kept her eyes closed. And then Becca had stormed in, date in tow. Attendees were still milling about the community center, greeting friends and renewing acquaintances. At any moment, Delta would welcome everyone, and dinner service would begin. More than anything, Marsh wanted to talk to Helen alone. He noticed a small ring glinting on her finger. She'd been wearing gloves when he'd happened upon her at the house, and he hadn't noticed it earlier. His heart sank. That looks like a promise ring. Who gave it to you? Oh, this. Helen flashed it toward Becca. Becca and I found it earlier. I meant to turn it in to the high school lost and found, but then I lost track of time. Sorry. Becca frowned, craning her neck to look around. Maybe we can get Principal Slaughter to take it. I saw him here somewhere. Helen. A woman briefly touched Helen's shoulder. Her name tag said she was Tina McNamara, formerly Tina Norman. When Helen turned to glance up at the woman, Tina added, "It is you. I was looking forward to seeing you again. My daughter plays volleyball now and she loves it when I tell the story about the time you jumped up to block a shot and got tangled in the net." Oh. Helen seemed to draw into herself. How nice. It's just that you always picked yourself back up, Tina continued with a broad smile. It's such a good example for the girls. Helen is something, isn't she? Marsh laid his arm across Helen's shoulders, not liking that Helen wasn't recovering her good cheer. Do you remember the time Helen raised more money than anyone in school for new auditorium curtains? We could always rely on her to fundraise. Tina nodded. Oh, I see Kate coming in. We'll talk later. Helen turned toward Marsh, not squirming from beneath his arm. You remembered my fundraising? He nodded. You sold candy canes out in front of the gazebo every weekend during December. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. I told you I had a crush. I remember a lot about you. Helen's gaze softened. Hey. What's going on here? Becca poked Marsh's shoulder. He's trying to marsh me, Helen said, smiling tenderly. That's the second time you've used my name like a verb. Marsh shook his head. Oh, marshing is real. Becca laughed. I can make him stop, Helen. I'm not sure I want you to, Helen said with a sigh. Her admission made Marsh's smile broaden. Two other women approached the table, drawing Becca and Helen to their feet for hugs. We were talking about our memories on the drive up from Boston. The taller woman's tag was hidden behind her long brown hair. Do you remember the year we all played basketball? Yes. Without snubbing them, Helen sat down sideways in her chair, back to Marsh, as if she needed to establish a boundary between herself and her peers, even if it was only vertical. That was the year Helen made a basket for the other team. The shorter woman chuckled. As when Tina had approached her, Helen seemed to sink in on herself. Marsh laid his hands on her shoulders and gave them a squeeze. That was also the year Helen took 3 charges in one game. Helen glanced at him over her shoulder, a grateful smile on her sweet face. That's because I couldn't move out of anybody's way fast enough. Don't make excuses. It worked, didn't it? Marsh resisted drawing Helen into his arms. Barely. It did, the taller woman agreed. And after Helen made a basket for the other team, I was so relieved. I always thought I'd do it in the second half and that coach would yell at me. But he didn't yell at Helen. He hugged her. Coach Tyler was very forgiving, Helen admitted. The women eventually moved on to the next table and Becca turned to face Marsh, looking at him as if seeing him for the first time and realizing she liked what was happening between them. He could get used to that look. The reunion isn't as bad as you thought, is it? No. It's not. Helen excused herself and headed toward the restroom. Brandy Sue and a pack of women cut Helen off at the door. Without thinking, Marsh got up and hurried to join them. Oh, Marsh. Brandy Sue greeted him right away. Here you are. We were just talking about the time Helen knocked you off your feet when she tried to roller skate. As if I could ever forget. Marsh curled his arm around Helen's waist, drawing her close. That was the day she bowled me over and found a permanent place in my heart. I'm happy to say that I no longer have to hide my feelings for her. He pressed a kiss to Helen's temple. Her cheeks had a rosy bloom. He liked that, too. Nearby, a cell phone pinged with an ESPN alert, identifiable by their theme song. Marsh felt tension build in his shoulder blades. A man wearing an expensive black shirt and pressed slacks hurried over. I know my wife Brandy Sue hasn't introduced me yet, but I just wanted to say, don't do it, Marsh. Excuse me. Marsh scowled at the stranger and held on to Helen tighter. Don't retire. Brandy Sue's husband turned his cell phone screen to Marsh. The headline read, Marsh Jacobs considering retirement to avoid trade. If you're in need of career guidance, I can help you. Marsh doesn't need anyone's career guidance, Helen said in a voice that could frost treetops in spring. Are you retiring because you two are dating? Did you give him an ultimatum about staying in Boston? Brandy Sue would have looked down at Helen if she'd been the taller of the two women. I know you live in Boston, Helen, but Marsh's career is so much more important than yours. You shouldn't hold him back. There was a chorus of agreement from those around them. Marsh made a sound of disgust. Before he could refute Brandy Sue's remarks, Helen marched out to the lobby. Marsh hurried after her. Hey, wait up. He closed the lobby doors behind them, shutting out prying eyes. Don't pay attention to that. People assume all kinds of things and you didn't correct her. Helen crossed her arms. I was going to, but you stormed out. Marsh ran his palms over her shoulders, loosening her arms and capturing her hands. I needed to know that you were okay before I went back in and punched Brandy Sue's husband and told Brandy Sue to get out of my life. Helen bit her lip. I want to spend time with you, Helen. I want to see if there can be more than friendship between us. But the life of a professional athlete isn't private. For whatever reason, celebrity in this world seems to give others the right to tell the more famous person what to do. I can't always protect you from the opinions of strangers. He drew a deep breath. I'm going to go back inside and talk, Helen said firmly. No punches. Just talk. Marsh nodded. And maybe later, we can talk, too. I can't do it. Helen watched Marsh go back inside. He was more confident than she'd ever be. More certain of himself. I can't be the woman he needs. Helen wrung her hands. A part of her mourned, because she'd always feel like the tall, clumsy, too thin girl who stood out in the crowd for all the wrong reasons. A voice behind Helen had her jumping. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Helen turned, mustering a smile for Kate Dancer. It's okay. I'm kind of used to being a public spectacle in Christmastown. Kate nodded and made as if to walk past Helen and go inside, but then she paused next to her. When I think back to our high school days, you're a part of those memories, Helen. Here it comes. Helen braced herself. I remember a really sweet, shy girl who never fought back if someone made fun of her height or her athletic skill. Helen nodded. That much was true. Back then. We were different people than we are today. Kate gave Helen an understanding smile. You probably know how to handle anyone who doesn't respect you when you're at work or at the supermarket. There's just something about coming back here that brings up all the childhood vulnerabilities, you know? Helen nodded again. But we're both stronger, more mature women, Helen. And when we reach for something important, for someone important, it's because they're worth standing up and fighting for. Kate's smile turned a bit melancholy. Like love, right? Love? An image of Marsh came to mind, smiling at her the way she'd always longed for him to. Yes, love. Helen squared her shoulders. Thanks for the pep talk. Wish me luck. You don't need luck. Kate plucked a sprig of mistletoe from the bouquet on the table. You just need a bit of courage and some Christmas magic. Helen gripped the mistletoe in both hands. Kate picked something up off the floor and then held open the door for Helen. Marsh stood at Brandy Sue's table, a serious expression on his face. He was a good man. If Helen wanted to give a relationship with him a try, she had to have thick skin and a head as hard as his. At the table up in front, Delta tapped the microphone, turning her back on the empty seat next to hers. Can everyone take their seats? I have a few announcements before we start dinner. Hang on, Helen shouted above the murmuring voices and scraping chairs, channeling the courage and volume she'd needed to star in the production of It's a Wonderful Life. Paging Marsh Jacobs. The community center fell silent. All eyes turned her way. Apprehension chilled Helen, but only for a moment, because Marsh hadn't hesitated. He walked toward Helen, a grin splitting his handsome face. Graduates of Christmas Town and all their significant others, Helen began. I'm going to set the tone for the weekend. I'm not the gangly, fragile wallflower I was a decade ago. I've gone after the life I wanted, designing peaceful gardens and planting for the future. But I've always played it safe. And I think, that's why I was always tripping over my own 2 feet. Marsh stopped in front of her, so close. And yet, not close enough. Helen swallowed back her fears. But now, tonight, I'm going to take center stage and tell Marsh Jacobs something. His back to the assembled, Marsh cocked an eyebrow. I've gotten braver since I left Christmas Town. I don't need a man to protect me from the past. I need a man who'll stand beside me, the way you've done today, while we head toward our future. And I hope what I'm about to say doesn't scare you away. Helen held up her hand as high as she could. I've got a sprig of mistletoe and I'm not afraid to use it. Thankfully, Marsh kissed her. Thankfully, it wasn't a brief kiss. Thankfully, it felt like it promised forever.